Even as we begin Black History Month in 2023, the powers that be have insisted on adding new entries into our long history of violence and inequality. Fresh in many of our hearts is the brutal murder of Tyre Nichols by Memphis police in early January. There has been some initial accountability as 5 police officers have been fired and brought up on charges, and 3 EMTs were fired for failing to conduct an adequate patient assessment. But even that level of accountability cannot erase the tragedy of Tyre's death or the continued brutal assault on marginalized, especially Black communities, by those in power with authority. There is much to be said and done in response to this violence and in honor of Tyre's life. As a white person, I especially urge white folks to seek out and listen to Black voices at this time. I do feel compelled, however, to respond, at least briefly, to one specific issue. I have lately and repeatedly heard the cries around me, mainly by people who are not Black, demanding that protests of Tyre's murder be peaceful and nonviolent. We've heard it even from the highest levels, including Attorney General Merrick Garland, FBI Director Christopher Wray, and President Joe Biden. Garland went out of his way to say, "I do want to say, and I want to repeat what the family has said, that expressions of concern when people see this video, we urge that they be peaceful and nonviolent." President Biden's official statement similarly reminded us that outrage is understandable, but violence is never acceptable. Violence is destructive and against the law. It has no place in peaceful protests seeking justice. And Director Wray, while emphasizing how appalled he was by seeing the video of Nichols' beating, also emphasized that, quote, "As far as preparation, all our field offices have been alerted to work closely with their state and local partners, including in particular, of course, in Memphis, in the event of something getting out of hand. There's a right way and a wrong way," he said, "in this country to express being upset or angry about something. And we need to make sure that if there is that sentiment expressed here, it's done in the right way." In each of these cases, there is a firm awareness that what was done to Tyre Nichols was wrong. It was so wrong, in fact, that they can anticipate that people's grief and anger will be justifiably strong. But their shared concerns about violence betray our history of inaction. It is an admission that we, especially marginalized communities, have little to no trust in our justice system to be fair and impartial. At the most, we may see some limited accountability, but I don't know of anyone who thinks that this time we'll get it right. People within marginalized communities have the right to frank conversations about what their response to injustice will be and decide what is best for their personal and collective well-being. But it is a very bad look for outsiders to those communities, especially those who wield power and influence over the very violent systems themselves, to tell victims of violence that they must be nonviolent. I say this as a person who has spent a lifetime deeply committed to both the ideals and the practices of nonviolence. The calls for nonviolence by people who lead the violent systems that are hurting us rings hollow to me and feels hypocritical. I've not, for example, heard any of our leaders call for the police to act nonviolently in response to the protesters. Instead, I see authorities preparing to enact violence on protesters if their grief and rage get out of hand, if they don't protest in the right way. You know what is out of hand? Police brutality and systemic racism, to name just 2. But this violence, that violence of police brutality and systemic racism, that is part of the status quo. It is normalized, and so it's not viewed as a threat. Martin Luther King Jr. knew well this pain of always being asked to bear the burden of acceptable state-sanctioned violence. His letter from Birmingham jail put into words the exhausting frustration that comes from the constant demand to protest in an acceptable way. He wrote, We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I've never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was well-timed according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. This wait has almost always meant never. It has been a tranquilizing thalidomide, relieving the emotional stress for a moment only to give birth to an ill-formed infant of frustration. We must come to see with the distinguished jurist of yesterday that justice too long delayed is justice denied. If we spent more time in preparation considering the right way to, for example, establish justice, dismantle white supremacy, end poverty, and otherwise bring an end to oppressive systems and cultures, people wouldn't have so many reasons to express being upset or angry. People's anger and grief at injustice is not the root problem here. What is out of hand is over 5 centuries of violence, so much of which has been tolerated and often protected by the powers that be. As Dr. King also wrote, I would not hesitate to say that it's unfortunate that so-called demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham at this time, but I would say in more emphatic terms that it is even more unfortunate that the white power structure of the city left the Black community with no other alternative. The best way to prevent violent protests is not to threaten those who have something to protest. The best way is to create a just, equitable, compassionate society. We would love to simply celebrate Black lives, creativity, persistence, and joy this Black History Month. We would rather not grieve again and again, now for Tyre Nichols and Anthony Lowe. We would rather celebrate their lives. We would rather not have to protest at all. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.